In the 70s, the Yorkshire Ripper terrorised the north of England.
Leeds and surrounding areas were places of fear, while this maniac was on the rampage.
Peter Sutcliffe was the serial killer who seemed unstoppable.
For 5 years, he got away with it, time and time again.
He claimed a divine and deadly duty.
He said that he was on a mission from God.
But was Peter Sutcliffe born to kill?
I think he's mad and bad, all rolled into one. I was 14 at the time. I'd been with my sister, but she was walking up in front.
In August 1975, Tracy Brown was returning home from a night out with friends.
I just saw this chap walking towards me, and he stopped and looked at me. And then he started walking up the road. My dad was a real one for punctuality. You know, if I'd have been a second late, it'd have been me telling off. So I started walking up the road and I fell into step with him. It seemed really charming when I was walking up with him. You could tell he was from Yorkshire, but it was a high-pitched voice. I just remember him having this really dark hair and beard and these almost black eyes. Even though he was a stranger, I did feel safe. He did hang back about 2 or 3 times. He did say that he had hay fever and he was just stopping to blow his nose. But thinking back now, he must have just been arranging the weapon. This is why it happened. This is why he attacked me. He didn't say anything, he just grunted, you know, like, oh, of the impacts of each blow.
Tracy had been struck several times on the head with a hammer.
The actual injuries that were caused, I think I had some splinters of bone just in the centre of my head. After he attacked me, a car came down and disturbed him, and then he threw me over that fence over there.
Covered with blood, Tracy managed to crawl to a neighbour for help.
I remember the whole thing, what happened, because I never fell unconscious.
After surgery, she would provide police with an identikit picture of the assailant. Just 10 weeks later, on October the 30th, 1975, in nearby Leeds, the attacker would strike again. This time, his victim would not be so lucky.
The body was found at Scott Hall Road on the field at the back. That was a savage murder, and it was said to be a good time girl, which was implying that she was working as a prostitute.
28-year-old mother of 4, Wilma McCann, had been struck twice with a hammer and stabbed 15 times. Police didn't connect the incident to the earlier attack on Tracy Brown.
We thought it was just an individual act of murder, an attack on a prostitute, a punter that had got annoyed for some reason and overreacted and killed this poor woman.
But Wilma McCann's murder would not be an individual act. On the night of January the 20th, 1976, 42-year-old Emily Jackson had been trying to make some money on the streets of Leeds.
Emily was actually married and living with her husband. At that time, I think the family business. There was problems. I think there was a tax bill coming in.
The next morning, she was found dead.
The injuries that Emily sustained were horrific. He had stabbed her 57 times with a Phillips screwdriver. Emily had been butchered, and the police believed it was the same person that had killed Wilma McCann.
Even at that early stage, you start to think, well, a pattern is emerging, and it looks as if this could be one individual doing this. A question for us was, is this the classic serial killer that's going to go on and on and on?
Their fears would be justified. The Yorkshire Ripper would continue to outfox investigators and go on to become one of Britain's most prolific ever serial killers. In the mid-70s, the Yorkshire Ripper had brutally murdered 2 women in Leeds. Over a year passed with no similar killings, but the Ripper was far from finished. First, the body of 28-year-old prostitute Irene Richardson was discovered in a park. Then 2 months later, Detective Constable Andy Laptew was called to nearby Bradford.
This area, Manningham it's known as, was predominantly the red light area. In front of me is number 9 Oak Avenue. Flat 3 was where Patricia Atkinson was murdered.
In another city and operating from her flat, the 32-year-old prostitute had felt safe from the killer that had been terrifying Leeds.
The method of attack was severe blows to the head, followed by repeated stabbing to the lower abdomen. Another frenzied attack on a prostitute.
This sadistic murderer was using a sharpened screwdriver, or sometimes a knife, to repeatedly stab his victims after attacking them with the hammer.
All the crime scenes were disturbing. When you see a human being that had been mutilated in such a horrible fashion, it's bound to have an effect on you. Your thoughts are clearly for the victim. That's your first thought. And secondly, you want to actually apprehend the offender and bring justice to the person who's been killed.
But with 4 bodies and no obvious leads, police were struggling.
The serial killer is so random. They have no connection with the individuals that you know of. So therefore, investigating a serial killer is extremely difficult.
Ever since he'd attacked 14-year-old schoolgirl Tracy Brown, all the killer's victims had been prostitutes.
Many serial killers target prostitutes for a couple of reasons. One is they have conflict sexually, and prostitutes do something for them sexually. But the other and more important reason is the hardest thing for a serial killer to do is the abduction, to get a victim to go with them. That is completely ruled out with prostitutes, because prostitutes will go with anybody. It's part of their job description.
Just when investigators were able to track an established pattern, the Ripper made a shocking move that no one saw coming. 16-year-old Jane MacDonald was a happy-go-lucky teenager who loved nothing more than going out dancing or roller skating with her friends.
A young schoolgirl, not involved in prostitution at all, had a boyfriend, was enjoying life, and she fell victim to this monster. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Jane's mutilated body was found dumped beside a children's playground. The discovery spread panic across the north of England as the reality dawned that no woman was safe.
Leeds and surrounding areas were just places of fear, while this maniac was on the rampage.
Everyone was frightened. It was an awful time. It was a very black time for West Yorkshire.
It was at this point that the press would dub the murderer the Yorkshire Ripper, harking back to Britain's most notorious serial killer.
It was already a hated entity at that time. But with Jane's death, it induced a massive wave of public sympathy, which only strengthened our resolve to capture the Ripper.
Police monitored red light districts around Bradford and Leeds, desperately hunting the killer. But the Ripper remained one step ahead. In October 1977, on an allotment next to a cemetery, the body of Jean Jordan was found. The 20-year-old prostitute had been murdered more than 40 miles away from the previous victims. But finally, a break. Jean would give police their first real lead.
When Jean Jordan's body was found, a search of the area discovered a handbag. Now, inside that handbag, in a concealed compartment, was a £5 note.
The note was brand new, and detectives thought it may have come from Jean's last customer, who might have received it in their wage packet. If they could find that person, there was a chance they would find the Ripper.
We went to the Bank of England, and the Bank of England told us that this note was part of a batch, when it was printed and where the bulk of these notes went. And a batch of millions of pounds from memory, that was a lot of notes.
The police established the note had been given to one of about 5,500 people across 34 companies, just days before Jean Jordan had been murdered.
And one of the companies was Clark's, which was a local transport company. So we went to Clark's and they told us whose wage packet they'd gone into.
One recipient was a lorry driver who'd just bought a new house with his wife in Bradford, 31-year-old Peter William Sutcliffe.
Sutcliffe was the elder child of 6 children, and he was said to be kind of a sickly, weak child, very, very close to his mother.
He was a mummy's boy. He was always hanging on to his mother's skirt or apron. A quiet, shy boy.
His father, John Sutcliffe, was very flamboyant. He wasn't at home often, but when he was, some of the children were frightened of him. Certainly he was very much a bully to his wife. He had affairs, he bragged about them to his sons.
Peter learnt how to view women, how to treat women from the hands of his father. One time, John Sutcliffe spotted Kathleen talking to 2 men in a pub. That's all, talking, and he slapped her straight across the face. If you overstepped the mark, as Kathleen did in John Sutcliffe's eyes, you were rapidly, violently and brutally brought back to your place. Peter probably was under pressure to be more macho than he naturally was.
So here we have this altar boy, which Peter was, and then we have his father saying, you know, this is what you do to be a man. And, you know, Peter was very much saw women as either Madonnas or whores.
His father really believed he would have this son that he could transform into the son he wanted. That's always a danger. What the father was inadvertently doing was creating the circumstances in which Peter Sutcliffe would create a persona that he perceives as being more appropriate than his true feelings about himself. So he's beginning to compartmentalize at a very early age in order to please Dad. And so the true part of himself is retreating into a secret world. And that's such a setup for a serial killer.
Detectives investigating the £5 note found on the body of Jean Jordan interviewed Sutcliffe twice. Each time he claimed that on the night of her death, he had been with his wife. His alibi was accepted. And the killing continued.
Just on our right here was where one of the victims was found under the settee. It's now a community centre. Yvonne Pearson. That's where he returned to the body and put a copy of the Daily Mirror under her arm, as if to cock a hoot at the police.
As well as Yvonne Pearson, 18-year-old Helen Ritker and 40-year-old Vera Millward were all killed in the space of 5 months. The Yorkshire Ripper was now the prime suspect in 9 murders. Police were under intense pressure to make an arrest.
What you've got to remember in those days, we didn't have the technology, we didn't have the communications, and all the paperwork was just that, it was paperwork. We had 8 or 9 murder investigation rooms which we brought together in the centre of Leeds. There were literally tens of thousands of lines of investigation which were all run manually.
The handling of the documents was a great problem because of the sheer bulk and weight of all the paper that was produced. So much so that the floor at the Millgarth police station where the inquiry became based had to be reinforced to prevent it collapsing.
Then in April 1979, the killer struck once more. This time 19-year-old Josephine Whittaker, another victim who was not a prostitute. Despite the largest manhunt in British history, police seem no closer to catching the Yorkshire Ripper. But in a shocking turn of events, they would receive a message from the unlikeliest of sources. Letters and an audio tape that purported to be from the Ripper himself.
I'm Jack. You are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
The letters and tape had been posted from Sunderland in Wearside, and experts verified the voice was a distinctive Sunderland or Geordie accent. With this extraordinary break in the case, detectives began to focus all their investigations in that area. But no one could have foreseen the devastating consequences of that decision. By 1979, the Yorkshire Ripper had savagely murdered 10 women when police received a tape from Sunderland, apparently from the killer himself.
I'm Jack. You are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
Detectives were told to discount suspects who did not have a Geordie accent. Meanwhile, Peter Sutcliffe, the lorry driver from Bradford, who had been interviewed in the £5 note inquiry, was interviewed again, this time by Detective Constable Andy Laptew and his colleague.
We attended at Sutcliffe's home address and spent something like 3 hours in his house, trying to eliminate him from the inquiry.
Police had been monitoring cars entering red light districts, and Peter Sutcliffe's car had been sighted a total of 39 times.
A very, very quiet man, completely void of any emotion. And his wife was the same.
At school, Peter was an unremarkable student. He was picked on and bullied by bigger children. He left without any qualifications.
After school, the young, painfully shy Sutcliffe flitted between several jobs before settling for 3 years in a role where his strange behaviour became even more apparent.
He was the grave digger and he also worked in the mortuary. And this was a job that he was said to absolutely enjoy, become obsessed with death and dead bodies, and there was all kinds of stories of grave robbing and so on.
He began to steal things off of the corpses, so clearly he wasn't scared of corpses, and then to play with them, do little party tricks with them. So we definitely have a person who's somewhat desensitized to death and used to corpses. He kind of knows all the mechanics of the behind-the-scenes stuff, and it's not a mystery, there's no mystique to it.
He would turn up in the pub with rings from bodies. He would want to touch them, he would want to put his hands in the bags that contained bits where somebody had been killed, for example, on a railway line. He was said to also play very kind of offensive jokes that he thought were funny, like getting a skull out of the ground and frightening schoolgirls with it. So it was strange.
In 1969, the Sutcliffe family would experience a traumatic event that would clearly affect Peter.
By John Sutcliffe's laws, it was okay for John Sutcliffe to play away from home. But when Kathleen did it, she was chopped down at the knees in a very humiliating and embarrassing fashion. John Sutcliffe had rung Kathleen pretending to be her close friend, and he told her to meet at this hotel and bring something for the night.
He then called the family to the hotel and exposed the mother as having this extramarital affair.
Peter watched horrified as John Sutcliffe pulled out a nightgown from Kathleen's handbag. It's just an awful thing to do, especially seeing as he wasn't whiter than white. Possibly it shattered Peter's image of his mother as a Madonna.
The idea that his mother had an affair, he's learning to hate that part of himself that identifies with her world. Now he can really hate women because not only has that female part of him kind of betrayed him, so has she. And now you've got the stage set.
Detective Laptew didn't know of Sutcliffe's unusual upbringing. But nevertheless, as he questioned him about the Ripper murders, he sensed something wasn't right.
Our interview with him rang certain alarm bells. There was no reaction whatsoever. This man was such a non-entity. There was something about him. There was just something about him that you couldn't put your finger on exactly, but there were certain signals pointed to this man. It created unease in me, unease in my partner at the time. There were certain things about him that made us suspicious. His physical description was one thing. The photo fit bore an amazing resemblance to Sutcliffe. The £5 note inquiry. His vehicle was spotted in the red light areas on more occasions than what was normal. So we did our report. In fact, I took it personally to the officer in charge of the inquiry, who, because of him not being from the northeast and not having a Geordie accent, summarily dismissed the inquiry.
Sutcliffe had now been interviewed 5 times, much to the amusement of his colleagues.
His workmates actually called him the Ripper because he'd been taken in that many times. But when he was let go, then they thought, well, you know, obviously it can't be. He didn't have that Geordie accent and he was off the hook.
Peter Sutcliffe would be interviewed 4 more times by detectives, and each time discounted. The huge police investigation continued with no luck and growing public frustration.
The town, well, you could describe it as a ghost town. In fact, there was a large protest march by women wanting to ban men off the streets after a certain time.
The police surveillance in red light districts seemed to help protect the prostitutes, but it also had a very tragic consequence.
The red light areas were getting too hot for him. He was obviously aware of the police presence there and decided to change his hunting ground.
On September the 2nd, 1979, student Barbara Leach became the Ripper's 11th known victim.
Poor Barbara, she was found in a niche used for dustbins.
Over the following year, there would be 2 more murders, neither of whom were prostitutes. Civil servant Marguerite Walls, and then student Jacqueline Hill. While police were stretched to the limit, the public lived in fear.
The investigation into the Ripper murders went on, it seemed like forever. It was always one step ahead. We never seemed to get closer.
With so many murders to his name, the Yorkshire Ripper was the most wanted man in Britain. All detectives could do was hope he would slip up and give them the lead they needed.
It's not through hard work that most serial killers are arrested, it's by accident.
Detectives were at a loss, and the Yorkshire Ripper was still at large. Then in January of 1981, in an unexpected twist, police in Sheffield would be unwittingly drawn into the investigation.
2 police officers came across a vehicle, 2 occupants in the vehicle, a man and a woman, and discovered that the number plates did not tally with the vehicle. That rang alarm bells, so they arrested the driver for suspicion of theft of number plates.
The man asked if he could urinate in the bushes, which the police allowed him to do before taking him to the station. There he was identified as Peter William Sutcliffe.
And at that point, I like to think they unearthed my report, which made them look at Sutcliffe as a potential serial killer as opposed to just a thief of number plates.
Realizing they'd been fooled, the arresting officers returned to the bushes. There they found a hammer and a knife.
Sutcliffe knew he was caught, and it was then he said, "I know what you're leading up to. It's me, I'm the Ripper." From 3:30 on the Sunday to I think 4:30 on the Monday, he confessed his crimes.
After 5 years at large, the Yorkshire Ripper was finally behind bars.
Out of the blue, an officer mentioned to me that the Ripper had been caught. And I thought, oh, that's wonderful news, that's fantastic. Who is it? Do you know who it is? And she replied, a fella called Peter William Sutcliffe. Well, you can imagine the bottom fell out of my world. Bearing in mind that 3 women had died since I submitted that report. And it's something that'll always haunt me. And all sorts of factors start bombarding your mind with doubts. I don't think I'd be human if I didn't.
I just remember being in the pub at the time. There was a television said that they'd arrested a man in the connection with the Yorkshire Ripper murders. It was just the feeling of euphoria, you know, just absolutely fantastic feeling.
Sutcliffe had been interviewed an incredible 9 times by police during the investigation.
In a major investigation like this, the police interviewed thousands of people. Some of the officers said when they interviewed Sutcliffe, he seems cool and calm and he didn't get anxious at all. And they felt that if he was guilty, he would have been more nervous and more anxious. Actually, that's not correct. Many innocent people feel very nervous and very anxious when they're being interviewed by the police. But a serial killer has a good ability often to detach themselves emotionally, and so they may not give the appearance of anxiety or the appearance of guilt.
Peter Sutcliffe was a methodical murderer. For 5 years, he led a secret life. He held down a job, he held down a marriage, possibly was on a power trip by doing this, and he got away with it time and time again.
By the time Sutcliffe was finally arrested, it was obvious that the Wearside Jack tape that had caused a police hunt for a man from Sunderland had been a devastating hoax, and therefore potentially cost the lives of the last 3 victims. But why had Sutcliffe embarked on his reign of terror? In custody, the Yorkshire Ripper would make an extraordinary claim.
He said that he was on a mission from God, and God told him to rid the world of prostitutes.
Sutcliffe said that in 1967, when he was 20 years old and working as a gravedigger, a voice had spoken to him from a headstone. Asked what had happened, he later explained.
Something that I felt was very wonderful at the time. I heard what I believe then and believe now to have been God's voice. I remember getting a message from the grave.
The voices were telling him to clean the streets. And when one of the brothers visited him in jail and said to him, "Why did you do it, our kid?" He said, "You know what it's like, I was just cleaning up."
If you saw Sutcliffe casually in those days, you probably believe he's a sort of quiet, normal individual. You wouldn't have any fear. You wouldn't feel, oh, a bit uncomfortable about this person. He would talk about the weather, he would talk about sport, he would talk about what was in the newspapers. But when he'd talk about the murders, some of the horrific injuries he committed on these women, he would talk about that in the same vein that he talked about a football match. And that's where you can then see and sense that this is different, this is not normal. His mission, he said, was to rid the world of prostitutes. And I said, look, the young girl, Whittaker, she was not a prostitute. And he said that, I mean, remarkably, he said, I thought that. When I was walking with her, and when I hit her over the head, she was crying and she was saying, don't hurt me. And I was saying to God, I was looking up at God. He's telling me, so I'm looking up at God and saying, look, this, you must be wrong. This is not, you know, I shouldn't be doing this. And this is when God was really cross with him. God was saying, you question me, this is the devil's work. She looks innocent and she's the devil's work. And so he said that's why he caused her horrific internal injuries.
But not everyone would believe Sutcliffe's story of his divine mission.
He never told his father or his brother or anybody in close confidence to him of voices. I think the voices were a convenient case for Peter Sutcliffe.
This elaborate idea of of, oh, the voice of God, when I was digging graves, the voice of God came to me and here was this on the tombstones. If somebody's going to claim schizophrenia, there will be documentation. There'll be other people saying, oh yeah. He didn't have that in his life.
He was overheard saying in front of a prison officer that if he could pretend to be mad, he'd only do 10 years instead of 30 in prison.
So if Sutcliffe wasn't on a mission from God, just what had triggered one of the worst cases of serial killing in British history? Peter Sutcliffe claimed that when he viciously murdered 13 women, he had been on a mission from God. But the evidence at crime scenes alluded to a motive that was more sexual than divine.
Definitely a sexual serial killer, and I do believe the knife represents his impotence, his inability to really have normal sexual relations. The knife, that sort of penis substitute, stabbing, so that it's an instrument of anger, but it's also a replacement for this idea of penetrating women.
The number of people who act out on their very perverse and deviant fantasies is very, very tiny compared to the huge number of individuals that have those fantasies and don't act out. There seems to be a triggering event that leads the individual to commit his first sexual murder.
Could that trigger have been humiliation? In 1969, Peter Sutcliffe discovered that his then girlfriend had been spotted with another man.
To get even, he said he'd gone with a prostitute and hadn't managed to have sex. And then a prostitute, they laughed at him when he'd seen her on another occasion in a pub. He'd felt humiliated, absolutely humiliated. And I think that's when his hatred of prostitutes started.
The major emotion associated with killing is humiliation. Not anger, not frustration, but humiliation. That could have been created by going to a prostitute and not being able to perform, or the prostitute making fun of his performance, and he gets humiliated as such and then has to go out and act accordingly. It's a humiliation that you can't undo or neutralize by a killing. And when that's the case, it can lead to serial killers who have to repeatedly deal with that humiliating feeling that they have within themselves. Why is murder the first crime in the Bible? Cain killing Abel, his brother. Cain's sacrifice was rejected by God, and Abel's sacrifice was accepted. Cain was humiliated. He killed Abel. Now, everybody that's humiliated doesn't kill, but humiliation, I feel, is by far the most important emotion associated with homicide.
Shortly after his humiliating encounter with a prostitute, Sutcliffe committed his first known attack. He hit a prostitute over the head with a stone in a sock. She thankfully survived, but Sutcliffe went on to commit several other non-fatal attacks before Wilma McCann became his first murder victim.
When he does it once, he is now acting out what he had fantasized about for so many years, and it becomes so pleasurable to him. There's a compulsion to do it again. It's compulsive and repetitive, and he's driven to do it. The overwhelming majority of serial sexual murders are not mentally ill in an overt sense, in terms of a psychosis. Now, they're not normal. Clearly, they're not normal, but they're not psychotic in terms of hearing voices, being delusional, and this sort of thing. God and delusions always come up once the individual's arrested and has to account for himself in court.
Peter Sutcliffe the infamous Yorkshire Ripper, stood trial at the Old Bailey in 1981 on 13 counts of murder and 7 of attempted murder. His defence claimed he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, but this was rejected by the jury, and Sutcliffe was found guilty on all counts and given 20 life sentences. But the question remains, was Peter Sutcliffe born to kill?
The best way to understand serial sexual murder is that it's part of the offender's sexual arousal pattern. These individuals are hardwired to that extent. Many of these individuals will say from a very early age they knew something was wrong, and what aroused them sexually was very, very deviant. And I think that's the case with Sutcliffe as well as so many other serial sexual murderers. Is he out of control with it? No. He can control it, but he chooses not to control it because it's so stimulating to him, it's so gratifying for him.
As a Christian, I don't believe anybody is born to kill. I think that when you hold a baby in your arms, that their future is determined by the people around them and their environment.
When we look at the steps up from, childhood and experience within the family, I think he was building up to becoming a psychopathic killer. I don't think he was born to kill, but I think he became a killer.
Of the 6 Sutcliffe children, the other 5 did not turn out to be murderers. But the way he was brought up, I do believe, made him form his attitude to women. I think it was a massive part in making Peter Sutcliffe the Yorkshire Ripper.
I think Sutcliffe was not born to kill. I think he clearly had anger issues. I think he had a lot of influences to compartmentalize so that he would be acceptable to his parents. And within that formed the anger and resentment against himself and against women. That certainly had nothing to do with any organic disorder.
I don't think Sutcliffe was mad at all. I think it was just evil. The only way he could get sexual gratification was by killing these women.
I just think it was some evil that was inbuilt into him, just the way he was wired. I just think he's been using God and these voices as an excuse. He's where he is, and he deserves to be where he is until his dying day. I think he's mad and bad, all rolled into one.
Whatever Sutcliffe's reasons for his murderous rampage, for some, the devastating impact of his crimes remains evident to this day.
Even though it doesn't affect me as much now, but there's not a day that goes by when I don't think about it. It's always teasing at the back of my mind. It'll be with me till my dying day, definitely. Thank goodness I've been able to move on with my life, and I've had the strength of character to move on with my life. 13 other people lost their lives and they weren't so lucky.